allow myself to introduce myself. If you guys remember that famous scene from a movie. Why did I start off with that? Because today we're talking about complicated complications. Or the complexity of complications. So how complicated can a complication be? It's a topic that's often overlooked because most of the time you're going to find people talk about chronographs, annual calendars, perpetual calendars. Well, Marco came up to me today and said, Roman, let me take you on a journey through complications, starting with least complicated all the way out to most complicated. But more specifically, I believe the word you mentioned is prestige. And we brought some pieces here, basically randomly picked based on the complications, or how complicated the complication is. How many times am I going to say that word? I don't know today. But I'm going to let you give sort of the foresight in regards to how this is going to go about, and then we'll go one by one.
Yeah, so I have obviously lined up a couple of different insane complications that we have the luxury of having. Starting, first from annual calendars to perpetual calendars to manual wind chronographs, and you go down the list of perpetual calendar chronographs, all the way up to tourbillons and minute repeaters, right? So see, these are some of the most prestigious complications in the entire watch industry. The main reason being that there's very few watchmakers on Earth that can actually execute these kind of complications, right? You have to factor in, first of all, these are often very complicated movements consisting of hundreds of parts. Second, the regulating organs need to be fine-tuned to a much higher degree. There's very few watchmakers that have the ability and the skill to be able to do that, especially when we're talking about these higher level complications. And
not only to be able to execute them and actually make them, but to make sure they're actually working.
Yeah.
There's plenty of chronographs out there that you can pick up for $20, but that doesn't mean that's a properly working chronograph, right? So would I be correct to say that the purpose of this video is a lot of what we touched upon in our previous videos, and that is to bring the general public, bring the general watch collector out there back a little bit closer to the world of horology, because I feel as if in the last 3 years we've sort of lost sight of what these things really are. These uber complicated, tiny little mechanical wonders, as I like to call them, that perform a task that seemingly would seem impossible considering there's no battery inside of them. This is fully mechanical, made by hand, and things of that nature. Living in a world of hype and living in a world of, oh my God, this is such a great investment. My watch just went up in value 20%. I feel like we're in the perfect timing and market to bring people back a little bit closer to what this is all about, and that's horology.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start at least from the left, or at least my left. So we're talking about the 𝗙PGeourn OCTA calendrier, which is, I think, one of the nicest and most unique looking calendar wristwatches ever made. This is an annual calendar from 𝗙PGeourn. It's one of the few calendar wristwatches he ever made. He only made, as far as I know, 3. So there's this one. He made a perpetual calendar in a super small batch and super small quantity. And he also obviously has his ultra grand complication, which also is a calendar wristwatch. But this one here is super interesting to me for the format of it, right? It's so distinctly 𝗙PGeourn. It's unlike anything else I've ever seen before. It's automatic also. It has that octa movement, the 5-day power reserve officially, although it's closer to 7 days because the drop off in amplitude in the last 2 days. So I think this is one that is not only prestigious, but also extremely unique. Right, it's a testament to the watchmaker who made it, who's really a creative genius of sorts. And you compare this to something like the 𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗀 Langmatic annual calendar that we have here. It's very different. This is much more classical looking. This is very German in its aesthetic, right? It's very symmetrical. It's very precise. It feels, even when you engage the pusher at the top left, it just feels very precise, very
Well, let's back up a second and talk about, again, the difference between the two is you're looking at something that's executed very traditionally. If you think of a perpetual calendar, you're immediately going to think of those sub-counters or on the dial, and you can, regardless of the brand, you can always envision a perpetual. When you look at 𝗙PGeourn, it doesn't really scream annual calendar. And just to bring it back a second as well, for those that are watching that may not be familiar, an annual calendar is just that. It will show you all the functionality minus the year as well as the leap year that of a perpetual calendar, which we'll get into in a second.
An annual calendar has to be reset only one time per year, whereas a perpetual will run continuously for 100 years without needing to be obviously reset. So annual calendar itself, you just have to readjust it essentially in the month of February, and then from there it can essentially keep track of the day, date, and month continuously all year round. So very interesting complication, something that was originally done by Patek Philippe, I want to say in the 90s. It started with the 50-30, I want to say 50-30 something reference. But yeah, those were the first annual calendar wristwatches made by Patek Philippe. They're probably the most well-known maker of annual calendar complication, but you see the likes of Lange and even 𝗙PI do their own takes on these complications in very cool ways, in my personal opinion.
And mind you, when you're looking at a Lange, who's now part of Richemont Group, imagine the watchmaking power or capabilities, I should say, behind a brand such as that, that's part of such a big group.
Yeah.
And then you take that back to an 𝗙PI, which is an independent watchmaker who has probably 3% of the capacity of that of Lange or Richemont Group as a whole.
Yeah, certainly at the time that he made this wristwatch.
Exactly, yeah. And it just shows that how impressive that is for an independent to make a perpetual versus a big brand that's part of a big group, because the resources available to a Lange are way higher and bigger than those available to an independent watchmaker such as 𝗙PI.
Yeah, so if you go from annual calendars to something scaled up a little bit more, even more complicated, are perpetual calendars. Now, perpetual calendars were first done by Patek Philippe also in a wristwatch, but obviously a number of brands have come out to make their own perpetual calendar systems. Essentially what it does is it keeps, it's really in the name, it's a perpetual calendar, so it will keep track of the day, date, month, leap year, and the year continuously for 100 years without regulation. So essentially, once that 100 years hits, it just needs to be re-regulated by a watchmaker because it's based on a specific year ratio. So all the months, the day, the leap year, and also even the date of the week are all based on a specific gear ratio that they follow that need to be recalibrated every 100 years. Now, this is probably, I feel, one of the most famous and certainly a groundbreaking movement for its time. It's by IWC. So it's the 𝗙_𝗏 Perpetual Calendar System. And at the time when it was released, I want to say in the late 80s, it was a kind of a collaborative project between 𝗙_𝗏, the watchmaker who made it, and Günter Blümlein, who was the head of IWC, and then went on to also start relaunch Lange. To me, this is a movement that's way ahead of its time, and it's very telling just by the fact that this became a collaborative movement between IWC and JLC. They will actually use the same movement in collaboration with one another. Obviously, they're both under the Richemont umbrella, so that helps too. But the watch itself, first of all, what makes the system so unique is the fact that...
Well, differentiate that system, let's say, from the system prior to that.
Yeah, sure. So something like this has one pusher to adjust the entire calendar, right? So usually like a Patek Philippe perpetual calendar, you're going to be looking at 3-4 pushers on the side of the case.
Be all over the place.
Exactly, and you're going to have to set it in a very specific manner because otherwise, one derivation, you're going to have to recalibrate the entire calendar, again, because of that specific gear ratio. But something like this can be calibrated with the push of one button, which is super innovative, especially when you consider this was done in the late 80s when there was no computers, there was no, like...
I mean, they had computers, but they weren't exactly as powerful as our iPhone.
They weren't useful in the watch industry, and these were not watches made to scale, right? They were all made by hand. And then you compare it against something like this, which is from de Bethune. The IWC is much more of a classic perpetual calendar. Again, it's a sub-dial kind of look to it. De Bethune itself, floating lug case, perpetual calendar, even that orbital moon phase, is so distinct. It's such a crazy take on a perpetual calendar, and I absolutely love that. Even the two-tone
Now, the system in that watch is more the same of that in that IWC.
Yeah, it's more or less the same in the sense that these will obviously have the same kind of gear ratios calibrating the calendar system. However, obviously the look and
well, what I'm finding a lot of the independents doing is, look, it is very difficult to reinvent the packet of ketchup, right? Like, there's not going to be another ketchup packet out there, right? Yeah. Obviously, Heinz being the leader in the industry, et cetera, et cetera. There are many brands that do ketchup, but ketchup is ketchup. It is what it is. And a perpetual calendar is a perpetual calendar. Very rarely nowadays do we find innovation outside of what's been set by the predecessors, going all the way back to the perpetual calendar and that pocket watch before Louis Breguet. And with that said, if you consider an independent company, their only option is very difficult to improve on something that works. Yeah. It's very similar actually to the gun industry. For example, the 1911 that was created in 1911. Actually, the first model came out in 1901. But the 1911 has been the same for 100 plus years because it's a system that's been perfected. It's a workhorse. It works.
Yeah.
You can take a 1911 from 1930 and one from 2022, and it will work exactly the same.
And you see a lot of this in the watch industry prior to the whole in-house movement craze, right? A lot of these brands would use the same kind of Lemania-based movements, Valjoux-based movements.
Do you feel it was Lange that forced a lot of these brands to get these in-house movements?
I think
after they came out with their chronograph.
Yeah, I think Lange certainly helped change the game. I wouldn't say it was so much. I think a lot of brands used it kind of as a marketing gimmick, but I will say that Lange were certainly one of the groundbreakers because of the release of the datograph in 1999, actually. So once that was released, right, it kind of put the Swiss watch industry in check. Like, whoa, it had been so long since we had started making our own, prestigious movements. Even Patek at the time was relying a lot of the time.
Lemania.
Yeah, you look at the 3970, even the 5004 was a Lemania-based movement with a split-second chronograph module added on top. So yeah, a lot of these were reliant on base movements. You look at, for example, something like this is a Vacheron Les Historiques with a manual wind chronograph. That's the Lemania 2310. Super historic. The 2320 was actually used by Omega in the original Moonwatch. Obviously, this is a workhorse movement, but certainly is outdated by today's standards.
I felt like Lange made it so that using a workhorse movement, be it a Jaeger movement, be it a Lemania movement, whatever it might be, I felt like they sort of made them aware, saying, "Oh, wait a minute, here's somebody outside of the circle, not Swiss, right, but German, right? Because listen, let's call it what it is. This is a Swiss boys club, right?
Yeah.
So, and here we are. They made their own groundbreaking chronograph, a really good chronograph at that, and not to mention the one that they improved on later, even. But maybe it's time for us to actually show people, hey, we're not just a name. We're not just slapping a name on somebody else's stuff. Now it's time for us to start making our own stuff. But to go back to the independent, what I said in regards to, hey, it's been there, it's been done. I really can't improve on a system of a perpetual calendar. They perfected it. So what do? I basically end up repackaging it and showing it different ways. And with guys like 𝗙𝗰🗲, you started seeing things like 3D displays, right? So now the actual moon phase is an actual round sphere, right? Where the moon sort of goes around in 3D. Now, one of the things that the independent watchmakers pride on is the fact that they make a good perpetual calendar. There's perpetual calendars out there, they're just not as good, right? Yeah. They're not as well made.
They're not as reliable.
They're not as reliable, right?
Breaking.
Where what the independents but actually have to make sure is to make sure that it's most reliable. Because the minute they make a subpar complication, be it a perpetual calendar, and it's working so-so, and they're competing against the powerhouses and the likes of Jaeger, IWC, or even Lange for that matter, they're kind of screwed. So they have to make sure that it's top-notch, and they have to do something different, like, so let's say a 3D moon display.
Yeah, I was on a podcast, so the Gray Market podcast with Avi recently, and we were discussing kind of, the rise in independent watch brands. And I had told him, I think that independents today, I think people realize the kind of era we are in for watchmaking specifically, right? It's been a long time since we've seen essentially watchmakers take a risk and start their own business and their own practice, right? You saw this in the 1700s when, Breguet started up his house. You saw this with Ferdinand Berthoud, and then you go down later on, Patek Philippe started, Audemars Piguet started. The big name brands started as a mom and pop shop. People tend to forget that, right? Max Büsser and MB&F started 20 years ago as a mom and pop shop, although it might be more so a bigger kind of name and powerhouse. Same with de Bethune, right? Started by Denis Flageolet, who's the head watchmaker behind de Bethune itself. But I think we're in one of the most innovative periods of watchmaking, I would say really since that era, since the late kind of 1700s, early 1800s. And the independent watch brands are really at the forefront, redesigning kind of these older style complications, putting their own touch on it, and making these drastic improvements in the likes of an annual calendar with a 5-day or closer to 7-day powers, or in the likes of a kind of 3D perpetual calendar from de Bethune. Even, for example, this, right? We talked about a Lemania-based chronograph movement. Well, you go to Daniel Roth, who created his kind of double ellipse chronograph. This is actually based on a Girard-Perregaux movement, but the look of it is completely, it's unrecognizable, right? You look at this watch, you can never tell it's a
let's talk about Harry Winston next to it,
Yeah, the Harry Winston next to it. Again, that's another GP-based movement, but this time a perpetual calendar chronograph. So these brands, you see the conception with specifically, I would say Daniel Roth more so than Harry Winston, but an objective to essentially create and push the boundaries with what has been done.
And one thing you guys have to take note of, it's not taking the same thing and repackaging it different. It certainly sounds like it the way you put it, but it's not. Because when you get into things like retrogrades, when you get into different case shapes, when you get into different ways of displaying a chronograph on a dial or a moon phase, the mechanics to make it work do change as well. This isn't something where a program kicks in and says, okay, start spinning the moon in 3D or show me a retrograde chronograph. It's not just taking the same complication and repackaging it differently. The minute you change case shape, the minute you start adding exhibition backs, the minute you start displaying a functionality in a different way, there's a lot of R&D that goes into that. It's not just a matter of taking a plain Jane chronograph, I should call it, or standard chronograph and slap it into a different case. It's a lot more complex than that. So you got to give credit to a guy like Daniel Roth. You got to give credit to guys like Harry Winston.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think also, not to be neglected, right? Although I love independence, you look at the big name makers, right? The likes of a Patek Philippe and Long & Zone, which we'll get into.
We're now going from, to keep up with complications, annual calendar, perpetual calendar. We talked about a chronograph. And note that the chronograph is sitting past the annual calendar. Most people will think that we'll say chronograph, then annual calendar, perpetual calendar. The chronograph is one of the most complicated complications. I did it again. Most complicated complications out there. And the reason Marco went specifically with that Vacheron is because of the Lemania chronograph, because that's an iconic chronograph.
Yeah, it's an iconic chronograph movement, certainly. It's been used by the likes of Breguet, Patek Philippe, by Daniel Roth, Roger Dubuis. So many brands and watchmakers have used it before. And because, again, it's that workhorse, reliable movement.
Now we're going to jump to something that's more complicated, and that's when you start taking complications and putting them together. And again, it's not just a question, oh, I'm going to add a chrono, a perpetual calendar, an annual calendar, a tourbillon, or something else. It gets progressively more complex when you start mixing complications, starting with perpetual calendar chronographs.
Yeah, the reason, and to put into context for viewers, right? So people who may not understand, for example, the complexity of these objects. Each complication will take away from the timekeeping.
Let's look at it in terms of a gas tank.
Correct.
You have a gas tank, which is your mainspring in your watch, right?
Yes.
The spring that sort of winds itself up and slowly releasing that power in order to run all the components within the watch. When you're talking about a time-only watch, not much to it. When you're talking about adding a chronograph, now you need more gas. You're adding a power reserve indicator. You add any functionality. Actually, the better analogy is a better analogy is a boat.
It's not even just that. It's more so the amplitude would be more so like the torque required, right? So the torque
more power.
Exactly. It requires more power essentially to power and keep accurate time while powering these complications because. From telling
they're drawing power from the same source while trying to power different parts of the thing.
Exactly.
It's like a boat. I think boat is probably a better. I was on a boat with a buddy of mine, and it was a 92-foot azimuth yacht.
Yeah.
And we went out for a day. We wouldn't go to the ocean. We went down the intercoastal in Florida from Boca Raton all the way out to South Beach. By the time that the day was done, he went to get gas. I guess they didn't gas or something. And I'm like, well, how much did it cost to fill this thing up? He goes, $5,000. I'm like, hold on a second. We were out and about for 6-7 hours. We burned $5,000 of gas. He's like, yeah. I'm like, that's ridiculous. He's like, well, Roman, think about it. Air conditioning, generators, kitchen, lights, music, the motors themselves. Everything that's on a boat is powered by a single power source, a single source of fuel. And it's more or less the same with this.
Same idea, yeah. The mainspring essentially powers everything in the watch, or at least holds that power. And that power is transitioned into, obviously, the actual balance of the watch, which keeps timing, right, of the actual watch. So once that timekeeping rate is affected by, be it a perpetual calendar or a chronograph, whenever you engage these complications, it takes away amplitude from the balance. And this is really when it comes into fine-tuning and calibrating a watch. And that's why there are a few watchmakers who are able to do it, because not only assembling, disassembling a movement like this and servicing it, oiling its components, but also calibrating these movements is extremely complicated. That's why you have the likes of a Patek Philippe and a Long & Zone making these in greater scale than pretty much everyone else in the industry, because they're able to acquire the talent and the resources that are necessary to make something like this, which right here is the 5270p. Is probably, personally, I love the 5970, but I think I would take a 52, other than a 5970 Salmon, I would take a 5270 Salmon over pretty much every perpetual calendar. I think it's such a...
Perpetual calendar chrono.
Chrono, yeah. Because to me, it's such a special watch. First of all, it's the first in-house perpetual calendar.
Can I throw you a curveball?
Sure.
How about a perpetual calendar split-second chrono, the 5204?
Yeah, 5204 compared to something like this, perpetual calendar split-second chrono from 𝗿𝗏𝗄𝗯. I mean, listen, it's a tough contest because you look at the movement architecture and the finishing of 𝗿𝗏𝗄𝗯, I would think it's maybe even potentially
We just jumped up a complication in case you guys didn't notice. And by the way, I'm going to go back up to what we were talking about. A lot of times I see somebody, one of my friends or somebody wearing a chronograph watch, and they have the chronograph running because they want to see the big hand sweeping. I tell them, turn the chronograph off. They're like, why? I'm like, do you understand that you're literally making your watch work double time or overtime because you're running that complication? That complication is not meant to be ran the entire time. It can, but you're really stressing your watch out.
Depending on what type of chronograph it is. You can.
Well, my guy was wearing an offshore. Let's just say that.
Offshore.
Let's just say that chrono module is not the best. But look, we just went from a perpetual chrono to a perpetual split-second chrono. And this is where things get really hairy and really complicated because not only is a chronograph complicated, a split-second chronograph, which is, think of it as, it's timing a lap, right? Getting a lap time the one time you go around the dial, right? That's when it gets really complex. What goes on in that watch?
Well, we're talking about a split-second chronograph, right? So essentially what you're going to have is a splitting of 1 second off to another, right? So these will have different driving trains, and a watch like this, I mean, again, we talk about loss in amplitude from a chronograph versus, from a perpetual calendar chronograph to then adding another chronograph essentially to the watch to power the split-second aspect of it. I mean, it becomes even more complicated, not only to assemble, but to calibrate again because of the loss in amplitude to the balance. So all of these factors will make it so complicated, and that's what makes even this chronograph even more impressive in my opinion, which I think is probably the most complicated chronograph ever made outside of...
And that's the AP lap timer.
This was actually this movement made by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 as part of the...
Surprise.
Yeah, part of the concept line. They made... Actually, there's a video with 𝗙𝗰𝗲𝗄𝗏𝗏𝗏 who talked about making this movement way back in the day. And it's incredible just even conceiving a movement like this almost a decade ago now at this point, right? Stephen McDonald, obviously, who created the Evo chronograph for MBNF, is a creative genius in his own right, and created essentially a chronograph that can be run autonomously, two different chronographs run at the same time autonomously, which has never been done before. And that's what makes this lap timer and that Evo chronograph the two most complicated chronographs ever made, because they're able essentially to time functions that has never been done before in any chronograph period. And I would say something like this, I would even put above a tourbillon and almost above a minute repeater in terms of complication.
Well, that's why we have it sitting in the back and to the side.
Because it's something that's really in its own category, right? First of all, I want people to understand, because you start with a project.
I'll give you a comparison. There was a comedian, I forget his name, that once said that, how do you come up with a concept like the telephone?
Yeah.
And he said, you have to be high and out of your mind to sit in a room and say, I wish I could talk to somebody who's not even here. And this is on that same level, right? Where just to conceptualize a chronograph such as this, or the one that McDonald made for MBNF, it's like, how do you even...
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It takes a next level creative kind of genius, essentially, to be creating...
A mechanic as well, not just a conceptualizer, somebody who, from an engineering perspective, understands that it can actually be done.
Yeah, so to me, I think it's off to its side because it's so complicated. I don't even know if it can fit on something like this. To me, chronographs are the most underrated complications, and you can tell just by the scale that they were made at back in the day, right? So you look back historically, minute repeaters were made in the least quantity out of all complications because, again, it comes to calibration, but also fine-tuning the actual gongs of the minute repeater, right? That's very, very difficult to make a good sounding minute repeater. Most brands can, but doesn't mean that it will.
Because that also not just involves mechanics, it also involves, I believe, case design, acoustics, right?
Yeah.
So this is the first time when you bring in things like acoustics into a watch. But I feel like we're jumping ship. Let's finish off with the chronographs.
So
Let's get the tourbillons.
The reason I bring that up is because the second least made complication was a chronograph. And you see that, with the likes of a Patek Philippe 1518, even you go to the next one, which was the 2499.
Right.
I mean, they made only maybe 300 of these in about, like a 30 plus, 35 year production.
40?
Yeah, 40 between the two of them, year production span. So, I mean, we're talking about 600 watches in about 30 to 40 years, let's call it. That's not that many, and it just goes to show you how difficult these are to make.
Think about what the chronograph was meant to do. It was meant to time things, right? Going back to when these things were actual tools, right? When you didn't have your iPhone and a timer on your iPhone, you actually have to time something, and that's the one complication that people would get upset over if it wasn't working properly, right? If your annual calendar didn't flip over a day, you wouldn't lose sleep over it. But if you're sitting there trying to time something, right, and all of a sudden that chronograph is not functioning properly, it's pretty complicated to make it that accurate. In terms of loss of amplitude, right? Would you say chronograph takes the biggest toll on that?
Yeah, so there's about a 30, actually Stephen McDonald talked about this, there's about a 30-degree loss in amplitude each time that you engage essentially a chronograph, right? Which is pretty significant over time if you factor in, first of all, the mainspring isn't always continuously wound to the greatest length. So yeah, it's certainly up there. I would say also something like a tourbillon would probably be a huge essentially power suck because it needs to be constantly running for it to take effect, right? So tourbillon, patented by 𝗴𝗿𝗲𝗆𝗍 in 1801. It's been done by pretty much every brand under the sun since then. We have the likes of Vacheron and H. Moser, and my personal favorite on the table is the HM, I think this is the 3, right?
6.
HM6, sorry. That has that awesome spherical tourbillon at the top, and that you can actually open and close it. But yeah, tourbillon is one that was created for the Queen of France, because obviously her pocket watch was running slow. What did 𝗴𝗿𝗲𝗆𝗍 do? Well, with the help of John Arnold, as was mentioned in the comments, yes, John Arnold first kind of gave the schemes essentially to 𝗴𝗿𝗲𝗆𝗍, who ended up finishing the project. That's why he ends up getting the majority of the credit.
And I think he should get the credit because from conception to reality, making something a conception. I can draw up a quadruple tourbillon, but I can't actually make it if it's never been done before. I believe it's the person that takes the concept, improves on it, and actually makes it work is the one that should get the credit.
Yeah, and you'll see some different variety of tourbillons, right? Tourbillon chronographs you'll see, which we don't have on the table today, but there's a ton that have been made. Even perpetual calendar tourbillons. You see so much variety in terms of conception. But again, this is one that is definitely a very complicated watch because, again, the regulating organ to precisely keep time in an organ.
Dumb it down exactly how it works.
Yeah, so essentially a lot of the tourbillons, at least the 3 tourbillons on the table here, are 60-second tourbillons. So they'll do a full rotation once every minute. And the way that it works is what you have is the actual balance of the watch held within a cage that rotates. Now, the reason for that is because you don't want at any point in time the actual balance to be in a singular fixed position. Because what essentially that happens is the gravitational pull will weigh down on the actual balance, causing a loss in timekeeping rates, right?
So imagine here's your balance, right? For the lack of better showing, we should get Ian. We should get a whiteboard back here or something. So here's your balance. That's okay, and people are going to comment on this, right? Here's your balance, and here's your never mind. Here's your balance, right? And here's your watch. Let's say your pocket watch. It's just sitting in your pocket, and you have this constant 9.8 blah 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 pulling down on the mainspring, right? And it's pulling in the same exact spot. After a while, considering that, what's the thickness of that?
Yeah, it's like a fingernail.
Even less than a fingernail. I consider that force that we normally don't feel as we stay glued to the ground walking around, imagine that pulling on that balance. And eventually it's going to affect accuracy, no matter how you slice it. It's going to affect that balance to where it's not going to shoot the same consistent power, I should say, to the rest of the movement to make it work. But the minute you start taking that circle or that balance and start twisting it around every 60 seconds, that means you get an even pull on every part of that, every 60th part of that particular balance at an even rate. So that way, that balance is actually getting pulled on evenly, and that force of gravity is not constantly pulling down on one spot.
So uber complicated to make, something that requires a lot of regulation, a lot of thought behind it. So we've been down the list, starting with calendars, right? Annual calendars, then onto perpetual calendars. From perpetual calendars, even more prestigious, onto manual wind chronographs, then onto perpetual calendar chronos split-second perpetuals, lap timers, and then tourbillons. And then we go to what I feel are the most prestigious complications of them all, and those are any chiming watches, right? Starting with an alarm wristwatch. This one, probably most famously done, I would say JLC and Breguet probably have the two.
Well, I'll tell you, my favorite is the 5707 from Breguet.
Yeah.
I do like. The reason I like the Jaegers is because they're just much cheaper.
Yeah.
They're just like so affordable, you know?
Yeah.
If you want a chiming watch that's not a minute repeater, that's affordable, Jaeger alarm is just it.
Yeah, an alarm wristwatch is probably one step, I would say, under a minute repeater. And then you have, at the end of the table, two minute repeaters made by Breguet, who is the one who really did the kind of hammer and gong kind of system that is pretty widely used by pretty much every other brand and has been used, you know, essentially since he invented it. So I would say minute repeaters are the most difficult complication to execute because of the fine tuning of the actual movement and the sound of the actual watch.
Because now, like I said earlier, you're adding not just mechanics, you're also adding acoustics into the mix, which is a completely different science if you think about it.
Yeah. So you've seen, you know, the likes of Patek Philippe. You've seen even the likes of even, for example, 𝗙𝗵𝗲𝗯 has done minute repeaters himself, right? So people have tried to fine tune and perfect really a 300-year-old almost complication at this point because it's so prestigious. It's so difficult to execute, and it's in another level of complication.
It's also why it's most expensive too.
Yeah, it's also the most expensive, right? You look at Patek Philippe's minute repeaters, Breguet's minute repeaters, Longa's minute repeaters,
Any minute
and down
repeater,
the
really.
list. Yeah, they're always the most expensive, specifically because the amount of people who can work on it and the time that it takes to create a wristwatch like this. It's a work of mechanical art. There's no other way to describe it.
For me, what's funny is we start talking dollars and cents. Unfortunately, and you have, and I don't know why, but over time it just so happened that you'll notice that the chronograph is sort of in the mix again. I'm going to discount, I'm not going to talk about a super uber complicated chronograph, an innovative chronograph. I'm talking about just your regular chronographs. And while we have that sort of in the middle of the mix in terms of complications, in terms of price, chronograph is going to be first.
Yeah, you have such a huge.
It's going to be the cheapest, right?
Such a huge.
Where in reality, price-wise, it should be somewhere in the middle of the pack. Everything else sort of works price-wise. Take the chronograph out. You're going to go from annuals. You're going to go to perpetuals. Then you're going to go to perpetual chronographs, or a combination of complications. Then you're going to go to a tourbillon. Then you're going to go to a watch that chimes. And alarm is another one of those watches that's not priced based on how complicated the watch is. So the two complications within this lineup that are not priced accordingly to the lineup that we put in is going to be your chronograph, and it's going to be your alarm watches, which really is a shame. There's also hour strikers, the ones that strike the minutes, but they do fall in the range of, you know, around that
wristwatches,
you know, chiming wristwatches where, you know, it's in the price line of, let's say, that of a tourbillon per se.
Yeah.
But oddly enough, the funny thing to mention is that the most complicated and the most expensive look the very low key and least expensive, right?
Yeah.
You have a watch that, you know, that's why we've always said, you know, it's billionaire secret watches, right?
Yeah.
Because for those that know, for those that are able to actually even physically see the lever that you pull down to set up the minute repeater, which oftentimes when the watch is on the wrist, it's very hard to tell. This looks just like a classic tourbillon, right?
I mean, this just like, it blends into the wristwatch so well, right? It's the ultimate, if you know, kind of wristwatch guy's complication, right? I think there's no other complication that is like when you pull your sleeve up, people are like, oh, kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's my favorite billionaire secret watch would be a Patek Philippe 3939. I've sold 3 of those in my career. One of them was actually with a unique dial. It was one of a kind. Sold it for $550,000. This was a while ago. One of the first very expensive watches I've ever sold, actually. And I sold it to a guy who at the time was number 600 on the Forbes list, which, by the way, he was the most humble guy I've ever met in my entire life. Not a guy you'll find wearing a crystal Richard Mille. But what we just went through, guys, is sort of the basis of from where to where, why, how complicated these things really are, what it actually takes to execute one of this, so that when you're able to pick up a watch, you can appreciate it from a different perspective, not necessarily from a flex perspective, not from a resale perspective, because don't get me wrong, half the watches on these tables are a flex on a wrist. Some of them are so avant-garde, like the HM6, for example, the 𝗙𝗵𝗲𝗯, that's like, oh my God, you're going to get the flex factor out of it, right? But what we don't want you to do is, we don't want you to lose sight of what these tiny little mechanical wonders are all about. It's started with the fact that it was about horology, And it's still about the fact that it's horology first and foremost. Whenever I talk to a new watch collector, I always ask him a dozen of questions, right? And I always ask him, why don't you find out what type of complications you would like in a watch? Look at some of the history behind it and so on and so forth, because this hobby is not just about a flex or a monetary value, and a lot of these things do have monetary value that goes up in value. Some can double them as an investment, and
Yeah.
you know, watch indexes, and the JP Morgans are talking about all this stuff. But at the end of the day, let's look at this as, number one, a mechanical wonder. But there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to rank those mechanical wonders in the order of complications and find out just how complicated complications can get. There you go, I said it again. And I will leave you with this. There are levels to this stuff. So what we showed you is some of the basics. Then you get into things like
combining all
of these, and now that we gave you the basic, you can appreciate what a retrograde perpetual calendar, like a Patek 5013 that we have, which is a retrograde perpetual minute repeater. You can appreciate how complicated a Genghis Khan is, which is a minute repeater tourbillon with mechanical figurines moving on a dial. Yeah. You can appreciate a sky moon tourbillon, right? When you're talking about a perpetual calendar, chronograph, split-second chronograph, minute repeater, and a sky chart all in one watch.
Even a 5208R, right? Split or monopusher chronograph plus perpetual and a tourbillon all in one watch.
𝗙𝗰𝗲𝗄𝗏 astronomium watch. You know, there's so many complications.
And then last but not least, Patek Philippe Grandmaster Chime, right?
Grandmaster
not
Chime
to be outdone.
That's
the greatest.
The Vacheron's the Grand Comp.
Yeah, but that was like a huge clock. Like, that was like a Flavor Flav pocket clock.
Yeah, that was a big one. So if this is something that interests you, there's plenty more information out there in regards to this topic. Obviously, we can talk about this off the cuff and based on our experience and knowledge and passion, really, because we are passionate about these mechanical things. But there's plenty more information out there. Of course, if you want more information, if you have any questions about this video, comment below. You can also DM Marco on his Instagram account. As you may have noticed, he loves talking about complications, and he knows quite a few things about them. I often have to tell him to dumb it down sometimes because of that. But nevertheless, this is what we love. This is our passion. And I hope we ignited just a little bit more passion inside you, the collector, the watch lover, from the horological perspective, rather than some of the recent things that you've seen out in the market. Other than that, Marco, thank you so much for taking a stroll down complications lane. I want to ask you guys to like, comment, share, subscribe as always, and we will see you on the next one.